As the royal physician in Madrid during the year 1834, your life is about to take a strange and unsettling turn. The king is dead, but your duties are far from over. You're summoned to the private chambers of the late Ferdinand II, and what you find there is something so bizarre, so unprecedented, that it makes you question your very sanity. Before you stands Queen Regent Maria Cristina, her eyes filled with tears, making a request that sends a chill down your spine. With trembling hands, you approach the bed where the body of Ferdinand lies, and for a moment, even in death, the king who ruled with terror for 2 decades seems to mock you from beyond the grave. But it's not his face that draws your attention. No, it's what lies beneath the silk sheets, hidden from view. What lies there defined Ferdinand's reign as much as his cruelty, his paranoia, and his betrayals. It's the grotesque physical anomaly that would haunt history, whispered about for centuries but never written in the official records. The king's strange and oversized endowment, a symbol of both his deepest shame and his twisted pride. As you begin the delicate process of preservation, your mind drifts to the whispered stories you've heard around the palace, the special cushions, the desperate efforts to produce an heir, the silent suffering of wives. You're not just preserving flesh and blood here, you're preserving the very embodiment of a reign that was just as deformed, oversized, and ultimately destructive to everything it touched. Before we delve deeper into the stories of survival and torment, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you're fascinated by the hidden truths of history, and feel free to comment below with where you're tuning in from. It's incredible how we can connect across time and space, all because of our shared curiosity about the past. To understand Ferdinand VII, you must first grasp the truth of his birth. He wasn't cursed by witchcraft or divine punishment, but rather by the toxic legacy of centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had been marrying cousins, uncles and nieces for generations, creating a genetic nightmare that affected everything from mental instability to physical deformities. Born on October 14, 1784, at the El Escorial Palace, Ferdinand was the child of Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, both products of cousin marriages. From the moment he was conceived, the genetic lottery was rigged, and Ferdinand would soon pay the price in the most intimate and humiliating way possible. As Ferdinand grew from child to adolescent, it became painfully clear that nature had dealt him a cruel hand. His body began to develop in ways that confounded even the most experienced physicians. By his teenage years, whispers were circulating in the palace about the royal anomaly, the strange oversized appendage that defied all medical understanding. Secret records buried in the Vatican archives paint a chilling picture of Ferdinand's condition. One physician documented, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with an organ of such extraordinary size and shape that intimate relations may prove challenging." Another wrote more bluntly, "The prince's organ is like a billiard cue, thin at the base, thick at the end, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." In a time when male anatomy was judged by the standards of classical Greek proportions, Ferdinand's abnormality marked him as a freak of nature. What others might envy became a source of deep personal shame for the future King of Spain. But it wasn't just his physical condition that shaped Ferdinand. It was his upbringing, too. His father, Charles IV, was weak and disinterested in ruling, preferring to spend his time hunting. His mother, Maria Louisa, was known for her insatiable desires, openly flaunting her affair with Spain's de facto ruler Manuel de Godoy. Ferdinand grew up surrounded by betrayal, power struggles, and humiliation, yet it was his physical anomaly that had the most profound impact on him. The court buzzed with whispers about the young prince's condition. Servants snickered behind their hands, courtiers made subtle jokes, and foreign diplomats sent back reports of the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand soon learned that his body, his most private self, was the subject of ridicule, and this humiliation would foster a deep resentment that would ultimately shape his reign. As he grew older, Ferdinand became increasingly paranoid. He saw mockery everywhere, in the respectful bows of his subjects, in the forced smiles of potential brides, and in the formal addresses of his tutors. And sometimes, his paranoia wasn't completely unfounded. People really were laughing at him, though not always for the reasons he imagined. His tutors noted the changes in his behavior as he entered adolescence. He became secretive, vengeful, and cruel. Servants who displeased him were quickly dismissed, or worse. Ferdinand had learned how to use the power of his position to compensate for the powerlessness he felt due to his body. One particularly dark incident, recorded by a court chaplain, reveals the depths of Ferdinand's cruelty. When a young page accidentally walked in on the prince changing clothes, Ferdinand didn't just send him away. He had the boy flogged and his family exiled from Madrid. The message was clear: no one would witness the prince's shame and go unpunished. As Ferdinand approached marriageable age, the full extent of his anatomical challenge became evident. Dr. Francisco Flores, Ferdinand's personal physician, left behind secret notes that provide a disturbing window into the king's medical reality. One of the most chilling entries describes Ferdinand's condition as a most unusual configuration, with an organ that was thin at the base, expanding in circumference to an unnatural size. It was more than just physically strange. It was a source of immense psychological turmoil for the future king of Spain. The implications of Ferdinand's condition were immediate and glaring when it came to his future as both a husband and a father. Normal intimacy was simply out of the question, without significant medical assistance and custom-designed tools. In secret, royal craftsmen were commissioned to create what they delicately referred to as marital aids, specially crafted cushions and supports that would allow Ferdinand to engage in sexual relations without causing harm to his wives. But the physical challenges were only one part of the problem. Ferdinand's condition carried far-reaching psychological consequences. Desperate to overcome his difficulties, he became fixated on potions and elixirs that promised to normalize his anatomy or improve his fertility. Court alchemists and foreign physicians were brought in from all corners of Europe, each promising miraculous cures, but all their efforts ended in failure. He poured vast sums of money into these so-called remedies. He consumed concoctions made of ground rhinoceros horn, powdered pearls and rare herbs, all of which were supposed to restore his royal essence. Some potions claimed they could shrink his abnormality to more acceptable proportions, while others promised to enhance his fertility despite its unusual shape. But all of these attempts were in vain. Yet Ferdinand's desperation made him an easy target for charlatans and fraudsters. In 1802, Ferdinand married Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. This marriage, arranged when both were still in their teens, was supposed to be the start of a fairy tale royal union. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with romantic expectations, having heard Ferdinand referred to as the desired one by some of his supporters. She imagined a life with a handsome prince, not realizing the true nature of her future husband. The wedding ceremony was a grand affair. The cathedral rang with music and the streets of Madrid were alive with celebration. The young couple seemed to embody the perfect royal partnership. Maria Antonia was beautiful, intelligent, and excited to begin her new life. Ferdinand, for his part, appeared every bit the charming, attentive, and romantic prince in public. But when the wedding festivities ended, the true test began, their wedding night. The first sign that something was wrong came when Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with an unusual request. Special preparations for the royal bedchamber. Equipment, he explained, was required. Equipment that the ladies couldn't quite understand, but were assured was customary for royal couples. Custom-made cushions were brought in, alongside bottles of oils and other implements that seemed more medical than romantic. Maria Antonia, sheltered and naive as many royal brides were at the time, had no clue what to expect. Her education had been focused on languages, music, and courtly etiquette, with little to no information about the true realities of marriage. The facts of marital life had been explained to her vaguely by older women who themselves knew little about the specific challenges she would face. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber, Maria Antonia's first sight of her husband's naked form was enough to send her into a state of hysteria. One lady-in-waiting, writing years later, described the scene. Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself. She backed against the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster! Monster!" until we feared she had lost her reason entirely. Ferdinand's member, described by witnesses as resembling a large club with a thin handle, was far beyond anything the sheltered princess had imagined. Its size alone terrified her, but it was the bizarre curvature, the twisted shape and the strange growths along its length that truly broke her composure. What followed wasn't a romantic wedding night. It was more akin to a medical procedure. Ferdinand's specially trained physicians had to be called in to explain to the horrified princess what was required of her. The custom cushions were set up, the oils were applied, and what was supposed to be an intimate union became a clinical, almost surgical process. Contemporary accounts hidden in private letters between court physicians reveal the disturbing dysfunction of this moment. Ferdinand required the custom-designed pillow to support his massive appendage, preventing it from causing injury to himself during intimacy. Even with these aids, the process was so traumatic for Maria Antonia that she had to be dosed with a laudanum to endure it. The psychological toll on both partners was immense. Ferdinand, already paranoid and insecure about his condition, became even more twisted after seeing his wife's obvious revulsion. Maria Antonia, on the other hand, began to suffer from what modern psychologists would recognize as severe sexual trauma. She turned to laudanum in increasing amounts, becoming addicted as a means of escaping the horrors of her marital duties. Their attempts to produce an heir became a ritualized nightmare, a grim routine that repeated itself with tragic regularity. Ferdinand would summon his physicians, who would prepare the chamber with its specialized equipment. Maria Antonia, heavily sedated, would be compliant but distant. The procedure would take place with clinical precision, after which both would retreat to their separate wings of the palace to recover. As the months turned into years and no pregnancy resulted, Ferdinand's desperation grew. He became convinced that his wife's obvious disgust was somehow preventing conception, leading him to experiment with more bizarre methods. Court records reveal that Ferdinand ordered the creation of special restraints, leather and silk contraptions that would hold Maria Antonia in place during their intimate encounters, preventing her from pulling away or showing her revulsion. These devices were crafted by the same artisans who designed the king's saddles and hunting gear, adding an unnerving layer of darkness to the royal workshops. In his obsession to father a child, Ferdinand consulted astrologers, astronomers, and even those versed in darker arts, all in the hopes of aligning the stars in favour of royal conception. The palace became a haven for quacks selling fertility potions, amulets, and rituals designed to overcome the curse of Ferdinand's deformity. One particularly bizarre episode involved Ferdinand consulting with a mystic from the Orient, who claimed that the prince's unusual condition was a sign of divine favour, that he had been blessed with a dragon's rod and simply needed the right rituals to unlock its fertility potential. For 3 months, Ferdinand continued to pursue these magical, unscientific remedies, clinging to the hope that somehow, against all odds, his greatest torment might one day be turned into triumph. Ferdinand, in his desperation, subjected both himself and his wife to bizarre ceremonies involving incense, chanting, and positions supposedly derived from ancient Chinese texts. Twice, against all odds, Maria Antonia did become pregnant. The court erupted in joy, Ferdinand's confidence soared, and Spain held its collective breath, eagerly anticipating the birth of an heir. But both pregnancies ended in heartbreak and devastating miscarriages, each one leaving the royal couple more shattered than ever. The first miscarriage, in 1804, occurred at 4 months. Court physicians claimed it was due to the unusual stresses placed on Maria Antonia's delicate constitution. What they couldn't openly admit was that Ferdinand's physical condition had made intimacy so traumatic that Maria Antonia's body simply couldn't carry the pregnancy. The second miscarriage in 1805 was even more harrowing. This time, Maria Antonia carried the child almost a full term before losing it in a labour so severe and bloody that it nearly claimed her life. The Queen never fully recovered from the ordeal, and her addiction to laudanum deepened, turning her into little more than a ghost in the final 2 years of her life. Ferdinand's reaction to these devastating losses was a true reflection of his selfishness and cruelty. Rather than show compassion for his wife's suffering, he became convinced that she was deliberately sabotaging their chances of producing an heir. He accused her of secretly taking substances to prevent pregnancy, of moving in ways that caused miscarriages, and even of harbouring secret liberal sympathies that made her unworthy of providing Spain with a proper Catholic heir. These accusations, whispered in the palace halls, ravaged what remained of Maria Antonia's fragile mental state. She began to believe that she was cursed, that her body was rejecting Ferdinand's seed because of some unspoken sin or divine punishment. Her last months were spent in almost constant prayer, begging forgiveness for sins she couldn't name and crimes she had never committed. When Maria Antonia died in May 1807 at only 21, the official cause was listed as fever and complications from her frail constitution. But the real cause was far darker. She had died of despair, her body and mind destroyed by years of sexual trauma, drug addiction, and psychological torment. Even in death, Maria Antonia couldn't escape the grip of Ferdinand's paranoia. Rumours spread that she had been poisoned, not by political enemies, but by Ferdinand himself, who had grown tired of her failures as a wife and was eager to find a new bride who might better fulfill his needs. These rumours gained strength after the mysterious death of the palace apothecary, found dead in his chambers shortly after Maria Antonia's passing. He left behind a cryptic letter, which Ferdinand's agents immediately seized and locked away. Some whispered that the letter revealed details about poisons administered to the Queen, while others believed it exposed the truth about Ferdinand's medical condition and the cruel demands he had placed on his wife. Ferdinand's behaviour following Maria Antonia's death was revealing. Publicly he displayed the appropriate grief, but privately there was a sense of relief. Within weeks he was already seeking out potential second wives, focusing particularly on women who had already proven their fertility by bearing children in previous marriages. Meanwhile, his physicians were working frantically to develop new treatments for his condition, as they realized that for Ferdinand to remarry successfully, intimate relations had to be made less traumatic for his new bride. This led to some of the most bizarre medical experiments in royal history, with doctors trying to create even more sophisticated marital aids and experimenting with surgical techniques to reshape Ferdinand's anatomy. By the time Ferdinand was preparing for his second marriage, his personality had already begun to show the dark traits that would define him as one of history's most despised monarchs. The sexual trauma from his first marriage, combined with his insecurities about his physical condition, had moulded him into a man incapable of true human connection or empathy. Ferdinand saw people not as individuals with their own feelings, but as tools to be used for his pleasure or obstacles to be removed. His first wife had been a tool that failed to function properly and had to be discarded. His subjects were tools to help him maintain power and feed his ego. Anyone who opposed him was an obstacle to be destroyed. Ferdinand's interactions with palace staff grew increasingly cruel. He tested the limits of his power by issuing arbitrary and harsh orders. Servants who accidentally glimpsed his naked form weren't just dismissed, they often disappeared without a trace. Guards who failed to maintain absolute secrecy about the royal chambers were sent to the most dangerous and remote frontier posts in Spain's declining empire. Ferdinand also became obsessed with the idea that everyone around him was mocking him behind his back. And in some cases, they were. But Ferdinand's response was disproportionate and violent. He began compiling lists of people he suspected of mocking him, planning elaborate revenge against them once he had the power to act. By 1807, Ferdinand had become the central figure in a complex conspiracy involving some of Spain's most powerful nobles and military officers. These men saw him as the key to overthrowing the weak government of Charles IV and his hated minister, Manuel Godoy. What they didn't realize was that they were aligning themselves with a man whose sexual dysfunction had twisted his personality into something far more dangerous than the incompetence they sought to replace. These conspirators, calling themselves the Fernandinos, worked tirelessly to build Ferdinand's reputation as El Deseado, the desired one. They spread propaganda about his intelligence, patriotism, and potential as a reformist king who would restore Spain to its former glory. But in truth, they were backing a man whose deep-seated insecurities and cruelty would ultimately shape the course of Spain's history. What they kept hidden was their increasing awareness of Ferdinand's deteriorating mental state and his growing, unsettling behaviour toward anyone who stood in his way. The conspiracy reached its peak in October of 1807 with the infamous Elascoral Conspiracy, where Ferdinand was caught plotting to overthrow his father with Napoleon Bonaparte's help. When the plot was uncovered, Ferdinand's response revealed both his cowardice and complete betrayal of everyone, including those who had supported him. Instead of standing by the men who risked everything for his cause, Ferdinand quickly betrayed them all. He confessed everything in great detail, naming every participant, and begged his parents for forgiveness. While his allies faced punishment, his betrayal established a dangerous pattern that would define his reign. He used people for his benefit, only to destroy them when it suited him. As Ferdinand's political games played out, his health took a turn for the worse. Court physicians noted that his condition, especially his anatomy, was deteriorating further. He developed abnormalities that made intimacy increasingly difficult. Some medical experts believe Ferdinand suffered from a rare condition called megaloas, a hormonal disorder causing continuous growth of his anatomy into adulthood. Regardless of the diagnosis, the implications were clear. Ferdinand would need specialized assistants and wives who could comply with his needs if he was ever to produce an heir. This led to one of the most disturbing aspects of his later marriages, his deliberate selection of women who could be mentally controlled or physically coerced into meeting his demands. Meanwhile, the palace craftsmen, now experts in creating bizarre marital devices, went to work. Their secretive workshops resembled a twisted mix of a medical lab and a torture chamber. They designed adjustable cushions, restraining devices, and other implements to make Ferdinand's encounters possible without causing harm to his partners. These craftsmen swore to secrecy, with Ferdinand ensuring their silence through both generous payments and terrifying threats. Rumours spread that several of them mysteriously died, fueling speculation that Ferdinand had them killed to prevent them from revealing the disturbing truth. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, forcing Ferdinand to abdicate, the king found himself in an even more humiliating position. Not only had he lost his throne, but he was now a prisoner under the watchful eye of the French, who were well aware of his shameful medical condition. French intelligence had gathered detailed files on the Spanish royal family, and Ferdinand's abnormality was undoubtedly among the secrets they held. During his 6 years in captivity at the Château de Valence, French doctors studied his condition with a disturbing level of scientific curiosity. Freed from the constraints that had restricted Spanish doctors, they conducted examinations and treatments that bordered on torture in their thoroughness. The reports from these French physicians, later uncovered in Napoleonic archives, offer the most detailed clinical description of Ferdinand's condition ever documented. They described an anatomical abnormality so extreme it seemed more fitting for a mythical creature than a human king. The French doctors speculated that Ferdinand's condition resulted from a combination of multiple genetic disorders, leading to a perfect storm of anatomical dysfunction. While in captivity, Ferdinand received updates on the efforts of Spanish nobles and military leaders fighting for his return. The irony was overwhelming. Brave men were dying for the restoration of a king whose primary focus was not on the war, but on finding solutions to his personal dysfunction and securing an heir. During this time, Ferdinand wrote letters to various European royals seeking potential brides who might accept his unique circumstances. These letters, written in his own hand, revealed a man detached from the suffering of his people and obsessed solely with his intimate issues. When Ferdinand finally returned to Spain in 1814, the crowds that greeted him were like nothing Europe had seen before. People threw flowers, wept with joy, and fell to their knees as his carriage passed. Children born during the war caught their first glimpse of the king their parents had fought to restore. Madrid itself seemed to rejoice as scorned to rejoice. Ferdinand waved from his carriage, but his thoughts were already focused elsewhere. His priority wasn't to govern Spain or reward those who had fought for his return. It was finding a new wife to give him the heir that had so far eluded him. Ferdinand's return marked the beginning of what historians would later call the ominous decade. But the true ominousness didn't just come from Ferdinand's political actions. It stemmed from his increasingly bizarre and desperate attempts to fulfill his royal duty to produce an heir. His personal failings became inseparable from the failures of his rule, leading to national catastrophe. His first action as the restored king was to commission a new set of marital devices from the finest craftsmen in Europe. He sent agents across Germany, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire to find artisans who specialized in creating devices for delicate royal needs. The collection, hidden in secret chambers of the palace, represented the pinnacle of perverse ingenuity that the early 19th century could offer. Ferdinand's second wife was Maria Isabel of Portugal, yet another cousin in the endless cycle of royal inbreeding that had cursed his bloodline. She was just 19 when she arrived at the Spanish court in 1816, full of the naive hope that young princesses often bring to these arranged marriages. The court physicians had briefed her attendants on the special preparations needed for her wedding night, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality that awaited her. Despite all the preparations, devices, and consultations with experts across Europe, Ferdinand's anatomical issues proved just as impossible to overcome. The screams that night were not those of passion, but of sheer terror and agony. Servants found blood-stained sheets and shattered furniture, evidence of a night that resembled a medieval torture session more than a royal union. Isabel never recovered from that night. Court observers noted that she developed a severe stutter and would flinch at the sight of Ferdinand. She began suffering what palace physicians called hysterical episodes, though modern experts would recognize them as severe trauma responses. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that Isabel would often wake from nightmares, screaming and calling out warnings about the monster that haunted her dreams. Ferdinand, however, viewed his wife's terror as an affront to his royal dignity. His paranoia reached new heights, and he began to believe that Isabel was conspiring with foreign powers to mock his condition. He had her letters intercepted, her food tested for poison, and her room searched for any signs of betrayal. What had begun as a personal failure had evolved into a full-blown political psychosis, infecting every aspect of his reign. The pressure to produce an heir became all-consuming not just for the royal couple, but for the entire Spanish court. Ferdinand arranged a series of increasingly bizarre medical consultations, bringing together physicians, anatomists, and even circus performers claiming to specialize in unusual anatomical problems. The royal bedroom became a laboratory for sexual experimentation that pushed the boundaries of both human endurance and dignity. One particularly disturbing account, found in the private diary of a court physician, describes Ferdinand's decision to invite foreign experts to witness his intimate failures. Desperate for answers, Ferdinand allowed German anatomists and French physicians to observe his attempts at procreation, turning his marriage bed into a grotesque medical spectacle. These experts took detailed notes and even sketched his intimate moments, spreading their findings throughout European medical schools, making Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction a subject of academic study. Isabel, subjected to this voyeuristic medical parade, began showing signs of complete psychological collapse. She stopped eating regularly, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and developed a distant stare that terrified even the servants. The young queen had become a ghost, haunting the palace that had become her prison. The political fallout from Ferdinand's personal failures was becoming impossible to ignore. Spain's American colonies, already in revolt, pointed to the king's inability to produce an heir as evidence of divine displeasure with the Bourbon dynasty. Revolutionary propaganda painted Ferdinand as a sexually impotent tyrant whose physical failings mirrored his political incompetence. Ferdinand's response was as paranoid as it was brutal. He initiated a new round of purges, targeting anyone suspected of spreading rumours about his condition or supporting the independence movements. The Inquisition, which he had re-established upon returning to power, began investigating accusations of sexual slander against the crown, creating an atmosphere of terror where even private conversations between married couples could lead to imprisonment or death. Ferdinand's obsession with secrecy grew absurd. He ordered hidden passageways built throughout the palace, so he could move between his and Isabel's chambers unnoticed by servants. Mirrors were installed at strategic angles to detect potential eavesdroppers, and a network of spies was created to monitor gossip about the royal marriage. Meanwhile, Isabel's health continued to deteriorate under the combined assault of Ferdinand's sexual violence and his psychological terror. Palace physicians noted that she developed what they termed phantom pregnancies, periods where she exhibited signs of pregnancy despite the impossibility of conception. These episodes provided Ferdinand with fleeting moments of hope, only to be followed by crushing disappointment when reality set in. The Queen's phantom pregnancies became a bitter irony in a court already consumed by dysfunction. Servants whispered about how the king would pace outside Isabel's chambers during these episodes, alternately praying and cursing, as though divine intervention could somehow overcome the mechanical impossibility of his situation. When each phantom pregnancy inevitably ended, Ferdinand would fall into deep depression, paralysing the government for weeks at a time. In 1818, after 2 years of this nightmare marriage, Isabel finally escaped the only way a royal woman of her time could, through death. Court physicians diplomatically attributed her passing to nervous exhaustion, though private letters from palace staff suggested she may have hastened her end through subtle self-harm. Her final words, according to her confessor, were a prayer of gratitude for her approaching release from her torment. Ferdinand's reaction to her death revealed the full extent of his psychological collapse. Instead of mourning his wife, he became convinced that she had been murdered by enemies seeking to prevent him from having an heir. He ordered autopsies, had Isabel's body searched for signs of poison, and arrested several of her ladies-in-waiting on suspicion of conspiracy. Ferdinand's grief morphed into a rage-driven paranoia, creating a vicious cycle of suspicion and brutality that consumed everyone around him. The funeral of Queen Isabel became a macabre spectacle that shocked even Ferdinand's supporters. The king insisted on viewing his wife's body multiple times during the preparation, touching the corpse and muttering about the lost potential of her womb. He commissioned a death mask and had it displayed in his private chambers, where visitors reported seeing him speak to the lifeless face of his deceased wife. But Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir could not be halted by grief or madness. Within months of Isabel's burial, his advisors began negotiating for a third wife. The challenge now was finding a European princess willing to marry a king whose previous wives had met such tragic fates and whose peculiarities had become the stuff of legend across the continent. The negotiations proved more difficult than expected, with several potential brides withdrawing after private consultations with physicians who had served at the Spanish court. Others demanded extreme conditions, including separate chambers and personal guards. Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction had become a diplomatic liability, isolating Spain from potential allies. Eventually, his agents found Maria Joseph Amalia of Saxony, a 24-year-old princess whose family's financial troubles made them willing to overlook Ferdinand's notorious reputation. She arrived in Madrid in 1819, older and more experienced than Isabel, yet still carrying the same doomed hope her predecessors had brought. The third wedding was a more subdued affair, a reflection of Ferdinand's aging years and the court's exhaustion from the repeated failures of royal marriages. This time there were fewer foreign dignitaries, simpler celebrations, and a sense that everyone was simply going through the motions of a ritual that had already failed twice. Maria Joseph, however, was better prepared than Isabel had been. She had received detailed briefings from Saxon doctors who had consulted with their Spanish counterparts, and she brought along her own collection of medical devices, as well as a physician who specialized in difficult marital situations. Her approach was less romantic and more clinical, treating her royal duties as a medical challenge to be solved with scientific methods. This practical mindset helped her cope better than Isabel, but it couldn't overcome the basic impossibility of Ferdinand's condition. The third marriage quickly settled into a routine of scheduled attempts at intimacy, each one carefully planned and medically supervised. These encounters had become more like surgical procedures than moments of marital affection. Maria Joseph kept meticulous records, noting times, techniques, and outcomes with the precision of a scientist. But Ferdinand began to suspect that his wife viewed him as a medical curiosity, not a husband. His paranoia grew, and he feared that she was secretly sharing his condition with foreign intelligence services. His spies reported that she had extensive correspondence with Saxon physicians, which Ferdinand believed were state secrets about his anatomy. Meanwhile, Spain continued its decline, plagued by Ferdinand's inability to lead. The American colonies, one by one, had achieved independence, taking with them the wealth that had sustained the Spanish Empire for centuries. The king's obsession with his sexual dysfunction had rendered him incapable of addressing the political and economic crises that were unravelling his kingdom. Cabinet meetings were often delayed when Ferdinand had difficulties with his wife, and important decisions were postponed for weeks as he consulted with physicians about new ways to conceive. The Spanish people, who had once celebrated his return, now saw the true cost of their monarch's restoration. Revolution simmered in the cities, while the countryside was controlled by bandits. Meanwhile, the king spent fortunes on sexual aids and foreign medical consultants, while his subjects starved. Spain had become the laughingstock of Europe, his decline symbolized by a king whose most intimate failures were public knowledge. In 1829, after 10 years of clinical matrimony, Maria Joseph achieved what many thought impossible. She became pregnant. The news shocked the Spanish court and spread through Europe, sparking speculation about how Ferdinand had finally overcome his anatomical challenges. Some believed it was divine intervention, others credited advances in medical science, while the most cynical wondered if the child's conception had involved infidelity. Ferdinand's reaction was a mix of joy and terror. He hired additional guards to protect Maria Joseph, brought in the finest physicians from across Europe, and had her chambers blessed by every religious authority in Madrid. His desperation to protect this pregnancy bordered on madness, and he convinced himself that enemies might try to sabotage his long-awaited heir through supernatural or scientific means. The pregnancy progressed smoothly until the 7th month, when Maria Joseph began experiencing complications. Modern medicine suggests she had placental abruption, a condition that could have been managed with proper care. However, Ferdinand's interference, his obsession with consulting mystics and alchemists alongside trained doctors, created a chaotic situation that hindered any effective intervention. On May 18, 1829, Maria Joseph went into premature labour. The delivery was a horrific scene, made worse by Ferdinand's insistence on overseeing the process despite lacking any medical knowledge. The baby, a daughter, survived only a few hours before succumbing to the complications of premature birth. Maria Joseph survived the delivery but never regained her strength, dying 3 weeks later from what physicians called childbed fever, though it was more likely a combination of infection and despair. Ferdinand's reaction to the double tragedy revealed the complete breakdown of his sanity. He refused to allow the bodies to be buried, insisting that his physicians keep trying to revive both the mother and child through increasingly bizarre methods. For nearly a week, the palace was filled with the stench of decay as the king demanded impossible resurrections. When he finally accepted their deaths, he fell into a depression so deep that court officials feared for his life. He stopped eating, refused to meet with advisors, and spent his days staring at the death masks he had commissioned for his 3 wives. Ferdinand had become a living ghost, haunting his own palace while Spain crumbled. But fate had one more cruel twist for Ferdinand III. In 1829, at 45 years old, the king who had failed to produce a living heir found himself facing an unexpected 4th marriage. His advisors, desperate to stabilize a collapsing kingdom, had arranged a match with Maria Cristina of Naples. What they didn't tell Ferdinand until after the negotiations were complete was that Maria Cristina was already pregnant by another man when she arrived in Madrid. The 4th wedding in 1829 was an absurd event that fooled no one. Maria Cristina was visibly pregnant as she walked down the aisle, carrying a child that could not possibly be Ferdinand's. But the king, desperate for an heir, accepted this obvious deception, believing that divine providence had finally answered his prayers through unconventional means. When Isabella II was born in 1830, Ferdinand's quest for a successor should have ended. Instead, it became a new source of anxiety. The king knew the child was not his, but he had to maintain the illusion of legitimacy to preserve his dynasty. His relationship with Maria Cristina was based on mutual deception. She pretended to respect him, while he pretended to believe the child was his. Ferdinand's final years were marked by the same sexual dysfunction that had haunted him throughout his life. Now burdened with maintaining a fraudulent succession, Ferdinand desperately continued his attempts to father a legitimate heir with Maria Cristina. These efforts, observed by the same parade of physicians and specialists who had witnessed his earlier failures, became even more pitiful as his age made success increasingly unlikely. The paranoia that consumed his final years shocked even the most cynical courtiers who had witnessed decades of royal madness. The king began conducting random midnight inspections of his wife's chambers, bursting in with armed guards in search of imagined acts of treason. These surprise raids terrified Maria Cristina's ladies-in-waiting, who never knew when they might encounter a wild-eyed monarch accusing them of conspiracy. Ferdinand's obsession with surveillance reached disturbing extremes. He had peepholes drilled between his and Maria Cristina's rooms, spending hours spying on her like a deranged voyeur. Palace servants reported seeing the king's eye pressed against these crude openings during her most private moments, while she nursed their daughter, prayed, or simply sat in quiet contemplation. Aware of the constant surveillance, the queen began to move through her rooms like a prisoner, carefully controlling every gesture and expression. The king's suspicion extended to everything, even food. His food-tasting rituals became drawn-out ceremonies of distrust, with tasters required to wait 30 minutes after sampling to ensure no slow-acting poisons could take effect. Ferdinand studied their faces with hawk-like intensity, looking for any sign of distress that might indicate poisoning. Several tasters collapsed from nervous exhaustion under the constant scrutiny, reinforcing Ferdinand's belief that assassination attempts were imminent. Maria Cristina, caught in this web of suspicion, began showing signs of the same psychological deterioration that had afflicted Ferdinand's previous wives. Her letters to her family in Naples, intercepted by Ferdinand's spies, revealed a woman losing her grip on reality. She wrote of feeling constantly watched, of jumping at shadows, and of being unable to trust even her own servants. She described her life as a glass cage, where every breath was monitored for signs of rebellion. The king's paranoia spread beyond his family to encompass the entire court. He rotated his personal guards daily, fearing that long-term service would lead to corruption. Cabinet ministers found themselves subjected to bizarre loyalty tests. Ferdinand would make contradictory statements in private meetings, seeing any correction as proof of treason. The Spanish court, once admired for its cultural sophistication, devolved into a theatre of mutual surveillance. Courtiers began speaking in coded language, avoiding eye contact, and carrying themselves with the wariness of diplomats in enemy territory. Conversations were whispered, and relationships were formed or broken based on perceived loyalty to competing factions. Everyone knew that a careless word could lead to imprisonment or exile. Ferdinand's relationship with his daughter Isabella became another source of obsession. Though he knew she wasn't his biological child, he simultaneously loved her as his heir and resented her as evidence of his sexual failure. He spent hours staring at her, searching for signs that she resembled him or possible fathers. He commissioned detailed portraits of Isabella at various stages of infancy, comparing them to paintings of himself and Maria Christina's previous lovers. The question of Isabella's paternity tormented Ferdinand, as it represented the ultimate symbol of his sexual dysfunction. Here was a child who would inherit his throne precisely because he had failed to produce legitimate heirs. This irony poisoned Ferdinand's few moments of happiness with his daughter. He began consulting genealogists and physiologists, hoping to find proof that Isabella's legitimacy was unquestionable. These experts, aware of the danger in satisfying his impossible demands, gave carefully worded opinions that could be interpreted to support whatever conclusion Ferdinand wanted. Their reports, later found in palace archives, revealed the length scholars would go to protect themselves while trying to appease the king. The king's efforts to control his wife's behaviour became increasingly invasive. He assigned specific servants to monitor Maria Christina's correspondence, instructing them to report not only the content of her letters, but also her facial expressions as she wrote. Ferdinand demanded detailed accounts of her daily activities, how long she spent in prayer, what books she read, and which courtiers she spoke with in public. Maria Christina, struggling to maintain any semblance of normalcy, learned to compartmentalize her emotions. She presented a serene public face while privately dealing with the constant pressure of surveillance. Her personal diary, discovered years later hidden behind a false wall in her chambers, reveals the mental toll of this constant observation. She wrote of feeling like an actress who must never break character, even in her dreams. Ferdinand's paranoia began to affect Spain's diplomatic relations. Foreign ambassadors reported his erratic behaviour and the instability within the court, leading to stalled marriage negotiations and questions about Spain's ability to honour commitments under such unpredictable leadership. Ferdinand's personal dysfunction had become an international concern. His obsession with assassination plots led him to see conspiracies in the most innocent of activities. When Maria Christina requested to redecorate her chambers, he viewed it as a potential threat. Ferdinand saw Maria Christina's request to redecorate her chambers as an attempt to create hiding spots for weapons or poison. When courtiers complimented the Queen's appearance, the king wondered if they were secretly communicating treason. Even religious observances were met with suspicion. Ferdinand questioned whether Maria Christina's increased devotions were true piety or covert messages to foreign Catholic powers. The financial toll of Ferdinand's paranoia was staggering. The crown spent vast sums on security measures, spy networks, and loyalty investigations, draining Spain's treasury while its people suffered. He commissioned secret passages throughout the palace, installed elaborate alarm systems, and maintained multiple sets of food tasters, guards, and servants to prevent any group from conspiring against him. These expenses, which could have been used to address Spain's growing financial crisis, only worsened the nation's problems. The constant strain of maintaining his surveillance empire began to take a physical toll on Ferdinand. His health deteriorated, with palace physicians noting chronic insomnia, digestive issues, and what they called nervous agitation. His paranoia created a vicious cycle, with each new fear justifying more behaviours that fed his anxieties. Maria Christina's attempts to shield their daughter Isabella from Ferdinand's paranoia only led to more conflict. The king saw her protective instincts as evidence that the Queen was preparing Isabella for foreign rule. When Maria Christina requested private time with her daughter, Ferdinand wondered what treasonous ideas she might be planting in the child's mind. The simple act of maternal bonding became yet another front in Ferdinand's imagined battle against conspiracy. Servants who worked closely with the royal family were caught in a web of impossible demands. They were required to report on the Queen's activities while maintaining the appearance of loyalty. The constant pressure caused many to develop nervous conditions, leading to a high turnover rate among the staff. New servants, unaware of the intricate loyalties and expectations, often made innocent mistakes that fueled Ferdinand's suspicions. Ferdinand's attempts to uncover the true identity of Isabella's father became more desperate and invasive. He ordered investigators to compile extensive dossiers on every man who had interacted with Maria Cristina during her time in Naples, searching for physical traits that might match his daughter's. These investigations extended to examining medical records, family histories, and even personal correspondence from years prior to Isabella's conception. His bedroom, a museum of his sexual failures, became a constant reminder of his unfulfilled desires. Portraits of his deceased wives, medical devices that failed to address his condition, and religious relics he hoped would provide divine intervention filled the space. Those who visited reported an air of desperation that seemed to cling to the walls. Ferdinand would often conduct royal audiences in this room, surrounded by these painful reminders of his personal failures, while discussing the state of Spain. As Ferdinand's behaviour grew more erratic, the psychological pressure on Maria Cristina mounted. She began showing physical symptoms of stress, hair loss, weight fluctuations, and tremors that she tried to hide during public appearances. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed that she had developed nervous habits, like constantly looking over her shoulder and jumping at unexpected sounds. Ferdinand's paranoia reached its bizarre peak in 1832 when he became convinced that Maria Cristina was poisoning him through intimate contact. He demanded that she undergo medical examinations before any physical interaction to check for toxins that might be transmitted through skin contact. These examinations, conducted by court physicians in Ferdinand's presence, marked the final collapse of their already strained marriage. As Ferdinand's reign spiraled further into madness, the international community watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. Diplomatic reports from this period reveal that European powers were preparing for the inevitable collapse of Ferdinand's government. Recognizing that the king's personal dysfunction made stable rule impossible, some nations began secretly supporting regional independence movements within Spain. They calculated that the fragmentation of the Spanish Empire would be more desirable than its continued rule by such an unstable monarch. By the beginning of 1833, Ferdinand's physical health began to show the full extent of the psychological damage caused by his reign of paranoia. Ferdinand's health continued to decline, with physicians noting persistent tremors, chronic digestive issues, and signs of early cognitive decline. His speeches became rambling, filled with accusations of the imagined enemies and references to conspiracies that existed only in his mind. When his end finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. After decades of turmoil, Ferdinand simply began to fade away, his body succumbing to the stress of a lifetime spent battling both his own anatomy and mind. In his final days, he drifted between consciousness and delirium, sometimes calling out to his dead wives, and at other times issuing orders to investigate non-existent plots. In 1833, Ferdinand II found the peace that had eluded him in life, through death. Officially, the cause was listed as gout, but palace physicians privately admitted that the king had died of sheer exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual. His decades of sexual frustration and political paranoia had taken their toll. The autopsy, conducted secretly by the very physicians who had spent years trying to solve his anatomical puzzles, revealed the full extent of nature's cruel joke. Ferdinand's preserved anatomy measured an astounding 14 inches in length, varying dramatically in girth from base to tip, as contemporary accounts had suggested. The discovery of internal scarring and deformity explained the decades of failure and frustration in his intimate life. But the autopsy uncovered something even more disturbing: evidence of deliberate self-harm dating back to Ferdinand's teenage years. He had spent decades attempting various forms of self-surgery, trying to modify his anatomy in hopes of making normal intimacy possible. These misguided attempts only worsened his condition, adding layers of psychological trauma to his physical abnormalities. The preserved organ, along with detailed medical drawings and written observations, was sealed away in the Vatican archives, where it remains to this day. Church officials deemed the materials too disturbing and politically sensitive for public knowledge, creating one of history's most bizarre state secrets. Scholars who have been granted access to these documents describe them as both fascinating and deeply unsettling, a glimpse into the private hell of absolute power corrupted by anatomy. Ferdinand's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on in the fractured Spain he left behind. Isabella II, the daughter who may or may not have been his biological child, inherited a kingdom torn apart by civil war, economic collapse, and international humiliation. The once mighty Spanish Empire was reduced to a minor European power, its decline accelerated by decades of misrule under a king whose personal obsessions overshadowed his public duties. Ferdinand II's reign serves as a stark reminder that power without wisdom is dangerous, but power combined with personal dysfunction can be catastrophic. His rule showed how individual psychological damage can metastasize into national trauma, how private shame can become public disaster, and how even the most intimate human failures can echo through history with far-reaching consequences. Perhaps most tragically, his story reveals the human cost of absolute monarchy, where the personal struggles of one man could determine the fate of millions. His 3 dead wives, his questionable daughter, his terrified subjects, and his shattered kingdom all paid the price for a genetic lottery gone wrong long before any of them were born. Ferdinand was both the perpetrator and victim of a system that concentrated too much power in the hands of someone so fundamentally unprepared to wield it. As the royal physician in 1834 completed his grim task of preserving Ferdinand's anatomical legacy, he must have reflected on the terrible irony. Here was the physical evidence of a reign that had consumed everything it touched: wives, children, subjects, and ultimately the king himself. The preserved organ became more than just a medical curiosity. It was a monument to the destructive power of shame, the corruption of unchecked authority, and the tragic waste of human potential. In the end, Ferdinand III achieved a kind of immortality, not the kind he had sought, but a different kind altogether. His name lived on, not as a great king or successful ruler, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of personal dysfunction masquerading as political power. His anatomical legacy, hidden away in Vatican vaults, serves as a reminder that some secrets are too disturbing for history to acknowledge, too human for legend to embrace, and too tragic for time to heal. The silk sheets that once covered his deformed body now cover a kingdom equally damaged, equally unable to function as it should. Ferdinand VII had finally found peace, but he left behind a Spain that would struggle for generations to recover from the intimate disasters of his troubled reign. The most perverted king in history had ended as he had lived, a source of suffering for everyone unfortunate enough to be touched by his power.